You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. The Rewilding Earth podcast is supported by businesses such as Patagonia and Catula, the Whedon Foundation, and listeners like you. If you love the work Rewilding is doing, please consider donating at rewilding.org. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast while you're there. A biochemist by training, Mark Fisher has worked in the pharmaceutical industry and in pure science. In a change of direction, he qualified as a permaculture designer and did work in landscape design. Mark launched a manifesto for Rewilding Britain in 2003, having been inspired by hiking the national parks and open spaces of Canada and America. He taught himself about wilderness ecology and rewilding and explores these through his website, Self-Willed Land, an advocacy website since 2003 for wildland and nature. His focus is the transformation of Britain through rewilding, a new future where landscapes of increasing naturalness will have open access to the public for physical discovery and spiritual enjoyment. Mark recently became a member of the IUCN Commission for Ecosystem Management as a result of setting up with others a task force on rewilding in response to the drift in its meaning, which is where we started our conversation today. I wanted to start off with the work that you've been doing of late. You are a prolific writer. You did a comprehensive report of the histories going all the way back to the Wildlands Project and Wild Earth and the halcyon days of Dave Foreman and Reed Noss and Michael Soule batting about this new term, rewilding.
And yourself, Jack, and yourself.
I came in about, 95, 96 and met Dave and was immediately thrown into the Sky Island mapping project and as executive director of Sky Island Alliance. What's going on there? Why did you feel the need to, really truly set the record straight about the origins of rewilding?
Well, the difficulty is that over the last decade, rewilding has been taken on as a term by people who really don't know anything about the origins of it, or at least have looked at it, and they very much made it in their own image. And one of the prevailing images that's come through in Europe is this concept of nature development coming out of the Netherlands. It's epitomized by a project in the Netherlands called Vadersplassen, which has been about leaving animals to breed within a large area, fenced-off area, to the point where they've reached a population where they start to starve and die because they just eat themselves out of house and home. They've reached food-limited carrying capacity. Now, for many years, prior to this point being reached, the advocates of this nature development were saying, well, this is how to create new nature. This is what rewilding is all about. And fundamentally, it is not. It's ecologically illiterate. And so what I've been doing as part of my advocacy website is trying to describe how this has happened, what is wrong about it, and what should be done instead. And really, it started back in 2003 when I first wrote my manifesto for Rewilding Britain. I eventually got it published in British Association of Nature Conservationists magazine. And we did a round robin amongst other people to write responses to each other's article. And I made the point that what was happening in the Netherlands was just making it very easy for people to turn around and say, well, the thing that mainstream nature conservation, which is a gardening approach to nature, is what is the same as rewilding. And it just wasn't true. It was just letting people have a license to do something that was just dead easy that they were doing all the while, but they weren't thinking about the ecological consequences of it. And very much my website is about me developing my own ideas. I'm self-taught about all these things. I was a biochemist when I was at university, and then when I worked in the pharmaceutical industry. So very much for me, it's about learning myself. And I suppose the reason why there are so many articles on my website, and they tend to be a bit long, is it's very much a very personal thing of using the writing of articles to to learn the ecology of ecological restoration.
Well, I can tell you that there's an awful lot of people in the movement doing the work. You are certainly what I would consider a self-willed expert.
Oh, that's very kind. That's a good expression as well. Yeah.
One of the things that we've been talking back and forth on email, so we have a little bit of a history, and it's so wonderful to be able to actually talk to you about some of the things we have been talking about. At first, when we really started ramping Rewilding up again, the website and a new board, pretty much a new board and a new vision for how we want to, interact and be a part of the movement between 2010 till just recently, May of last year. Rewilding took off around the world in ways that I think, Dave said in the very first interview on Rewilding Earth was pleasing to him and sort of surprising how much it's taken off. And it really does. And since then, we've talked with other people about their ideas on what has happened and how this is translated on the ground. And a couple of things that I saw, to watch people talk about things like, should we call it wilderness or should we call it wildness?
Yes.
And it was coming from people who were clearly never set foot in or if they did, were improperly impacted by wilderness. I mean, if you've never grown up with it, I've come to some sort of a better understanding of what it might be like to grow up in a place that has absolutely no wilderness. And then to look at rewilding and how it's described and stories of a land that has a lot of wildness left. I mean, 4% isn't that great, but we do have designated wilderness. What is it like to care, to have set foot in wilderness, to have experienced what wildness really, really, truly is, self-willed land really is, and then to live in Britain, where you have to be faced with so many people who don't get it?
Well, that's a very sore point. One of my colleagues' wives once said to me, "You can't enjoy walking anywhere in Britain." And I said, "Well, yeah, it's a tough ask to try and find someone somewhere which you couldn't criticize in some way for being affected by human management. It's very difficult to find self-willed land, land where there's no intervention. But I can't let that stop me from giving that story to people, that if you had the chance in your own country to walk in truly wild land, you'd be amazed at how wonderful it was and how uplifting it was and how it would humble you and give you an incredible experience in your life, and that you'd want to have more of it. And you wouldn't want to have to go 7,000 miles across the Atlantic to be able to do it. You want it in your own country. So it has been tough, but I think what I've tried to do, along with other friends, is to do the right thing. Is that there's a prejudice against wilderness in Britain. There is a presumption that wilderness is not right in Britain, that Britain is an entirely managed landscape, and that's the best landscape it could ever be, and that we really don't want wilderness here at all. And what you have to do is you have to pick away at that and say, well, think about trying to have a different approach to land. Don't feel as though you've got to manage it all. Try and take away this prejudice that you have all the while, and understand that what you will find is that there's an expression that is unselfing. When you go into a wildland place, it no longer becomes about you. It becomes about the ecology of the place, the big picture, where you as a human are looking at it in awe and learning from it. You lose yourself in it. And we try and put that enthusiasm, but also try and point out that one of the things we've talked about, I think, Jack, is that the rules of ecology don't change just because you're on a different continent. And for people to say that wilderness can't exist in Europe is a nonsense, because what we've done as a Wildland Research Institute, which is an institute I belong to at the University of Leeds, is that we've built a register of wilderness in Europe based on 13 criteria. We were employed by the European Commission to do this, to identify areas of wilderness in Europe to show that it exists. We did a report for the Scottish government when there was a resolution in the European Parliament about wilderness. They wanted to know what were the protected area systems in Europe that could protect wildland, and we produced that report. We've done all that we needed to do in Europe to show that there is no difference in the ecology between America and Europe, that there are highly protected areas in Europe like there are in America in the designated wilderness. We were the first people to show that the distribution of the large carnivores in Europe matched where the protected areas were, so people were getting it in the right place. We've documented the distribution of wolves marching westward across Europe. There's no country in continental Europe now that doesn't have a presence of wolves. It's only Britain and Ireland, because we are islands surrounded by water, that has this prejudice against large carnivores, that we don't have them ourselves. And what we've got to face here, I was involved for a short period in a project to try and reintroduce lynx into Britain, and it's a process that whereas if we're connected to the continent, the lynx would just walk across the boundary and it would reinstate itself voluntarily, and you'd have to strictly protect it. In Britain, we've got all these people who say, I don't want it here.
Yeah,
I don't want my sheep killed by it. Our landscape no longer accommodates carnivores. It's too modified. We just don't want it here. So very much, myself and my colleagues, we've laid the groundwork to say there's no reason why Britain should be anywhere different from anywhere else. There's no reason why Europe should be different from anywhere else. And all the systems are in place for us to have wilderness in Europe, to have large carnivores in Europe, and to have them in Britain as well.
One of the things I think that might have been helpful, I guess, is I've noticed that a lot of conversations with people who are in part of the shift or the drift of the true core nature and meaning behind rewilding, as originally, nobody here was taking into account Britain. When we were talking about, we were always talking about North America, primarily the States, but connecting to, and so you have to understand the backdrop of that is really huge, big wilderness areas, never even close to what we wanted, all cut apart by roads and developments and farms and things like that, and that we were working on reconnecting. And the only stakeholders in the room in the very early days were the people on the conservation side. And I looked around and I'm like, wow, we're not really, we're drawing lines on this map that goes right across this ranch land. When are we going to talk to that guy? Now, because we did that in a vacuum, sort of, and we did not consider that yet. It didn't mean that there weren't plans to consider that, to pull stakeholders in, but we approached it from the land first, from the wildlife and the crossings and the corridors that were needed. We were doing conservation biology, and I was taken aback by that a little bit, because it was like, well, when we make this map, this has got to make land managers and owners and other stakeholders very, very nervous to see a bunch of conservationists with red pins drawing lines on maps over their land, over federal land, state land, private land, and they all laughed, and it was good because we stayed pure. It's like, what does the ecology of this need? Let's deal strictly with that. A lot of conversations that I've had with people in Britain have started with, well, we have to go ask the people first.
Right. I'll explain that, because the difficulty is that we don't have this value system for public lands like you do in America. We have very little publicly owned land. It's around maybe at top 6%. And to me, wildland systems are based on public land, because that's what we found in Europe when we did the report for the Scottish government. Pretty much the status quo was that national parks in most of the countries in Europe are publicly owned land, and the strict nature reserves are also publicly owned land. In Britain, we have a protected area system. that is blind to ownership of land. So the majority of our alleged conservation lands are in private ownership, and those private owners need to be incentivized with money to ensure that the activities they carry out don't harm nature there. So in that sense, yes, we have a great difficulty here because there is no concept of using public land for wildland, and therefore most people think, well, the only recourse you have is to talk to private landowners to see if you can infiltrate some of your ideas about wildland, and that's really what rewilding in Britain has turned out to. It's about farming. It's not about creating full food webs. It's about how can you get agri-environment subsidy to allow you to graze your land and call it rewilding, because that's fundamentally all it is. That's what nature development is. It's a process of putting livestock within a fence, grazing the land, and calling it rewilding. And the epitome in this country, the chairman of the national charity Rewilding Britain, he's got a farm, 4,000 acres. He gets 1.4 million pounds income a year, of which around 400,000 pounds of that is agri-environment subsidy for doing nothing.
And rewilding without having to do any work.
The embarrassing thing about it, Jack, I can't tell you how people, I can't call them liars, but they misrepresent things. So this farm, they say, well, we've got all this wonderful new wildlife there, and it's all because of the cows grazing there. But actually, the new wildlife is there is because an area of arable land began to develop scrub, because they didn't get their agri-environment grant funding to put a fence around it, to put the cattle in, for about 8 years afterwards. So the scrub developed. This attracted all the wildlife in terms of the butterflies and the birds, etc., etc. Then they put the fence up, put the cows in, and said, oh, well, it's all down to the cows. I mean, it's just a nonsense. They changed the complete understanding of what rewilding is. What they say is that all landscapes in their original state were the same as they are now in farmland. That's what they call wild nature. And that's what they maintain in these landscapes inside these fenced areas. And there's no scientific proof for it. There's no justification for it. They just say that, and they do it, and they call it rewilding. And it's just appalling. One of the most inspiring things for me was to do that history of rewilding through Wild Earth and the Wildlands Project. Because every page of that was the ecology of wild nature. It wasn't making things up. It wasn't supposing something. It was learning from nature and learning how to be able to fit that wild nature into a landscape so that it was able to thrive alongside us. And when you look at what happens in Britain and in Europe, it's just rubbish. There's no ecological understanding. There's no conceptual approach to it. It's just a whim and a fantasy about turning grass blue, because that's what they want to do. They've got their own idea of what a landscape should be, and the way they achieve it is this one approach of putting up a fence and sticking livestock in it. What it's doing is hijacked the aspiration of ordinary people, young people in particular, for wild land, because they maybe don't spend the amount of time that I can in terms of understanding what's going on. And they're just pleased to hear these messages of alleged rewilding and take it at face value. We set up an IUCN rewilding task force, and we contacted the Commission on Ecosystem Management as part of the IUCN and said we're concerned about the drift in what's happening to the meaning of rewilding, and we very much like to set up this task force, which is a standard system within the International Union of Conservation of Nature, to spend a couple of years looking at rewilding, where it came from, and what's happening to now, and then report to them. And the basis of whatever report will be how the Commission of Ecosystem Management in the IUCN will regard rewilding from that point. So we very much feel it's an important task to be able to put down the reality of rewilding rather than the propaganda and steer that's going on, and draw it back to its origins, draw it back to the real rewilding, away from what these shifting rewilders are doing to it. There are some free-living beaver in Scotland, which are now accepted as being free-living. We have a trial of free-living beaver in England, which are not yet accepted as being legally free-living. And in both those locations, England and Scotland, the only reason why one of the populations of Scotland and one of the populations in England is there is because they were illegally leased in the first place. Mm-hmm. That's how people have become so frustrated about the fact that the simple thing of reinstating beaver is such hard work in this country. What we've got now, though, is we've got people say, oh, yeah, great thing, beaver. The whole country now is getting beaver mad about how great they are at managing landscapes. I mean, why do we have to look at wild animals as managers of landscapes? Wild animals have an existence. Let them get on with it. Anyway, what we've got now is other people who are getting hold of beaver from Europe, where they're free living, and sticking them behind fences and saying, we've just rewilded this place, we've brought back the beaver. No, you haven't. All you've done is you've used those beaver just like a cow in a field. And I'm afraid that's the mentality we've got.
A couple of times, and with a couple of guests, we went around the world. It started with Dave. People are trying to use the term. They are using it. They're like, we are rewilding, and some things they're doing great. That recent news article on the peninsula in Australia, where they're trying to put back a huge number of species. Actually, it seems very ambitious. And when I see that's the top layer of something, when I see people saying we want to put back all these species, I begin to become at least satisfied that somebody's trying, because if they're going to try to put back those species, they're going to have to right the wrongs that have been made on the land so they can even live there.
Exactly, yes. Yeah, and in Europe, you can find examples where they don't use the word rewilding. It's not a word that actually exists in most European languages, in the same way that not all European languages have a word for wilderness. One of the things that is understood, though, in Europe is non-intervention. And what you will find, I mean, it's a much easier thing to find in other languages, is that they'll talk about gradually increasing the area of non-intervention in a protected area. So, for instance, in Germany, all the national parks there, which are predominantly, well, no, they aren't, they're publicly owned, they've given themselves a target to have at least 75% of the national park area to be non-intervention. They've also set themselves a target nationally of having 2% of wilderness by area. They're going to have to get a wriggle on because it's by 2020, but nevertheless, they've set it in their biodiversity strategy to have wilderness. And there are other countries like Austria have aspirations to gradually increase the amount of non-intervention area in their national park. The further you go east, the greater this already exists, this idea of non-intervention, because they've got lands where the cores of their national parks are strictly protected, where there is no human activity other than enjoyment of the space and science. And I'm very struck by Poland's Dror National Park, where once they'd seen what would happen if they left an area of that national park alone, they've gradually been increasing the areas, the total area of non-intervention. So they may not call it rewilding, but it is the same thing very much. And what you have to do is you have to give these examples to show, again, Europe is not different from America. Ecology doesn't work on different principles in America and Europe. There are people who understand that the best way to get wild land is to withdraw human management from it, and it's happening. One of the things that strikes me is that the Wild Earth was a journal of people, local activists, and it starts there. Nothing happens unless you've got local activists wanting to be involved. It's not like I wasn't there, but I don't think the Wild Earth Project wouldn't go somewhere if they weren't invited.
There were people there who didn't even want to be on record as being there because it would conflict with their positions in government. I think the statute of limitations is far over by now, but so we involved them, but we had a moment of purity of just around the science. There was a moment in the beginning, and then you bring people in to sit around the table, look at all of these maps that have already been looked at, and say, here's where we think some connections can be made. Here's a corridor. Yeah. Here's a good buffer area. We'd have to talk to that rancher. We'd have to talk to this. The conversation was always there about the people.
But there are many countries that are very mature in the way that they look at their protected areas. So what they will do is they'll have a view of ecological networks nationwide, and they'll map them. And so they'll get people to understand, well, we've got these protected areas, but what we need to do is to link them up. And what we'd like you to do is to consider working on these areas and see what way you can contribute to doing that. And that's what a mature society does. And I thought it was quite interesting recently is that I noticed there's a bill going through Congress at the moment about wildlife corridors in America.
Yeah.
Bit late, considering what was in Wild Earth. But hey, it's another sign of a maturity towards understanding how wildlife works. And if what you can do is not have to necessarily always rely on activists, but what you can do is to give them a framework, a legislative framework, within which there is a backdrop to what they do. That's brilliant. And Hungary has an ecological network. There's an ecological network for brown bears in Macedonia. There was an ecological network for wildcats in Germany, and this is working at all these different levels. And when you can work with some kind of statutory backing, or at least federal or state backing, that's when you can get people involved. And what they have to do, in a sense, is bite down on their prejudice and become part of the team. You can have your disagreements, but what you don't get is a veto. And I think that's very important. I fear that very much wild nature is always kicked in the teeth because people quite often take to themselves a veto on its presence. And what you have to do is you have to put them in a situation where they have to think about not just themselves, but the whole of society thinks about wild nature, and that you come to a compromise amongst all yourselves about what you're able to do and what you're able to support.
One of the things that I really appreciate in talking to you is that I grew up in a place that I could go and get lost. And there was something bigger than me out there that could eat me.
Yes.
That is incredibly important. I know now. I took it for granted. I grew up with this stuff. But there's an example out there and several more that we talked about today, where if you are not exposed to that, or if you don't get out of the country and expose yourself to it like you did, this is how bad it can get. This is what people start to talk about and go, you know what? I mean, we're doing fine without wolves. We're doing, moderately okay with all.
Yeah.
And they're throwing away something they never had any value of in the first place. So it's easier for anybody to do that. And I don't exactly fault people for that, except that there's information like what we talked about today out there.
Yes.
And it certainly captivated you. You didn't stay in Britain and go, well, that's it. I mean, we don't have wilderness and we never will. And you really even, you went and sought it out very aggressively, actually, and came over several times and spent a lot of time in a lot of different wilderness areas and gained your appreciation for that.
Yeah. But also it's about learning about it. It's because I have to be able to articulate it. I have to see whether it's feasible. It's this thing about feasibility in Britain. I am certain wilderness is feasible in Britain It's the dirtiest. People don't even get past, the first step on that route, because they just completely reject it, and that's wrong. And what I've done over the years is to find for myself what I think are the most wildest places in Britain. And if I can, I take people there and I say, well, look, this may not be a wilderness, but it's totally different from what you're used to. And you need to experience this to have your eyes opened. We do have an appalling top level of received wisdom in this country. You can see it on the television and the newspapers. You'll see this pastoral scene, and everybody will say how beautiful it is. And I think, oh no, it's just a piece of farmland. But it's the common, not perception. Well, it is, because nobody knows any difference. If you're constantly told that Britain is a beautiful country, but it's overcrowded, well, that's a load of old nonsense, because 80% of the population live in 10% of the land. So that's not overcrowded at all. That's an enforced high population in urban areas. There are vast areas of the countryside in Britain that you could lose millions of people in, but they're kept for agriculture, and they're kept degraded landscapes as well. So you've got to break through an enormous amount of cultural prejudice and knee-jerk reaction to these things. But I think you can, if what you can do is to say there is something better and describe it, and then if you can, take them to see. Occasionally I can get people to come walking for me, and I'll take them a place, and I'll say, well, what do you see the difference? And we go from there. We don't do it enough. We don't have the impact that we ought to have in doing that.
Say someone grew up on this new version of conservation that really didn't tax humans in any significant way, that it was really built for. Right. If you grew up that way, you would not be faulted at all for thinking the way that you probably would about wilderness and things like that. Now, picture someone listening to this podcast and sort of we've pulled them out of the matrix. We've given them, I can't remember, it's the red or the blue pill, but they realize there's something else. What would you recommend someone do to explore this further and make an impact in the way that you've laid out, should be made?
What you can do is to get these young people to explore it for themselves, learn for yourselves, be inspired to go and find out about things like that. I mean, this sounds a bit trite, but it is the only way that wildland will go, is if people can start to not accept all the while the thing that they're fed all the while, but go and find out for themselves. Find the authors, find the painters, for instance. One of the things I love doing is, if there's an exhibition of landscape artists in one of the galleries, I go and look at them, because I'm looking for those ones, for the artists who just want to represent nature, not culture, nature, because that to me is the most fascinating thing. And we don't really have the great writers in this country on nature. They tend to be quite bound up in this idea of cultural landscapes, but don't restrict yourself to Britain. There are some great writers in Europe and in America, and look for those and look for their inspiration and bring it back.
A lot of good books recommended regularly by one of our board members, John Miles, on rewilding.org, and he's hard at work, always reviewing it. I saw him at a recent board meeting sitting atop around 50 books that had been recently sent to him that he had to manage to get through. He does a wonderful job. So there's a great reading list there. I know that you share an awful lot of things on your site about where people can go, lots and lots of links. But maybe let's take the pressure off of everybody trying to figure out exactly what are you going to be when you grow up kind of thing. It's just like shine a spotlight and really make them try to answer a question they have no way of answering. Get out in wilderness. Go seek that. I mean, everybody here, they take a break year and they go to Europe, and that's their thing. And I always wondered, where do people from Europe go when they're taking their do they come and how many of them actually go, I want to go get into some wilderness, if not in the United States, in Canada and South America and Brazil, Patagonia, that would be something to consider if you're going to take a break. Because once you go to one of these places, I've never met anybody who came away unaffected, ever.
Right.
Even the most cynical, even the most modern urbanite type person is moved. And maybe that's just the way to get started, is just go fall in love with wilderness yourself. And then maybe that can help you decide what you might want to do.
It's not hard either. I mean, the American system of wilderness it's there to explore. The information is easy. Transport is easy. Getting to the trailhead is easy. Finding somewhere to stay is easy. The bit you have to do then is put one foot in front of the other when you get there.
Now, we have three we have many, many long trails, but three of the most iconic are the AT, CDT, and PCT. Go look up those acronyms and see if maybe you'd like to. I'm not really into through hiking. I like following the through hikers' stories because there's no way to get through 48 different wilderness areas more efficiently than hiking the Pacific Crest Trail. You're going to go through a lot of, very, very, but then also a lot of very developed stuff in order to connect yourself to each of those things. And I'm not so interested in traversing those areas. I like to hop to things but I mean, there's so many.
I've done bits of the Appalachian Trail.
Yeah, and they're vastly different. We just had Tyler Sokash on, and he talks about the fact that you can't go 4 miles anywhere along the Appalachian Trail. I think this is the quote. I'll have to check, but I think it was 4 miles without crossing a road. Anywhere the length of, or for most of at least the length of the AT. And I was just like, what? And then he compared that because he also hiked the PCT. And he gave a much different, much bigger mileage between roads that you're going to cross, even just forest roads and things. So they're all different, but they're all going to put you in touch with what we need more people to just know about. It's really weird to say that we could make progress just immersing themselves in something. How could good in the world come from that? And I'll tell you, because of the Mark Fishers in the world. That exists because your passion and what you're doing exists completely from you're inspiring yourself, you immersing yourself, and you would never be the kind of advocate that you are for rewilding and protecting wilderness and things if you had not immersed yourself. And it started there for you, so why not make that maybe a good pointer for everyone else who's interested in what we're talking about and just wants to know what to do? Go have some fun. Get out there, be scared if there's a grizzly bear coming around the corner. Feel it.
Exactly. Yeah. Don't go out with bells rattling.
Nah, it doesn't work anyway.
You're not going. I walk. I'm very lucky where I live that we have what's called ancient woodland, and all that means is that it's had woodland coverage for about 400 years, because we can tell from old maps, and they have a particular wildness to them in terms of the way the trees grow, the soil, and the species there. And I'm very lucky. You're going to laugh at this, but if I see a roe deer in my woodland, it makes my day.
Yeah.
Because wild nature is so rare in Britain. It just doesn't. It's not given its own space. But we know there are roe deer in all these woodlands. We know that they mostly keep out of the way. We can tell they're there because they make a scrape in the leaf mold in the ground there, where they spend the night there. We know they're there, but then to catch them by sight, to see them, is just a wonderful thing. Absolutely, it's that sense of that atmosphere of wildness that woodland has. When you've seen a roe deer in there, because they're the woodland specialists. It's absolutely brilliant.
Mark, thank you for taking the time to be on Rewilding Earth and for the inspiration. We talked about some pretty hard topics, and it's not all fun and games, and it can look really bleak at times depending on your context and things. But would you rather be doing anything else? I mean, no. And I think you're an inspiration. I really do appreciate that you're here. That's
very kind, but no, you're quite right. I got here eventually. I've arrived at this. This is what's important to me. I'm going to die with it.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Jack.
Thanks for listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. Be sure to visit rewilding.org to subscribe so you don't miss past and future episodes. And while you're there, please consider supporting Rewilding by making a donation or subscribing to the Rewilding Earth newsletter.